April the 26th, 1915, saw the signing of the London Treaty by Italian representatives witnessed by England and France. This treaty formally declared Italy's departure from the Triple Alliance and plunged the entire nation into war. Among the European powers, Italy appeared the most likely to remain neutral during World War I. Neither large enough to dictate outcomes, nor small enough to be easily manipulated, Italy had been hoped by both the German-Austrian alliance and England-France to maintain its neutrality. There had even been moments when Italy could have regained vast territories without firing a shot. Yet, it ultimately took the plunge into the devastating conflict. After losing millions of young men and accumulating billions in debt, its gains at the Paris Peace Conference failed to match its initial neutrality. So, what compelled Italy to join the war at any cost? What ideology drove the entire nation to lose its senses? Why did fascism rise first in Italy? And why was its military renowned for its lackluster performance? With these questions in mind, let's delve into the story of that day. On July 30th, 1914, as war drums grew louder, a debate in Rome raged on, determining Italy's fate. At the center of this debate stood Giovanni Giolitti, leader of the Liberal Party, a man known for his firm stance on foreign affairs. However, this time, he staunchly advocated for Italy to maintain its neutrality. He argued that the war unfolding in Europe was unjust, and though Italy was a member of the Triple Alliance, it had no obligation to send troops. Moreover, he highlighted the unprecedented scale and scope of the conflict. Pushing the country into such a war without adequate preparation would render all efforts made since Italy's unification futile. To understand Giolitti's speech, we must first review Italy's history of nation building. The modern concept of Italy traces back to two Napoleons. In 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte's victory at the Battle of Marengo drove the Austrian forces out of northern Italy, laying the groundwork for his empire and igniting nationalist sentiments in Italy. However, by 1815, after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, Italy was once again under the control of the Habsburgs until the 1848 European revolutions. This period saw Italy's first war of independence, paving the way for another member of the Bonaparte family, Napoleon III, to ascend the French throne. With Napoleon III's support, Italy launched its second war of independence in 1859, culminating in the Battle of Magenta, where French forces triumphed over the Austrians, solidifying Italy's unification. After the unification, Franco-Italian relations experienced a honeymoon period, but fundamental contradictions ensured this closeness wouldn't last long. One such contradiction was the issue of the Papal States. As the protector of the Catholic Church, France staunchly supported the Roman Curia, yet for Italians, the Papal States posed the greatest obstacle to their unity. Another issue was North Africa. Both nations aspired to establish dominance in the Mediterranean, with North Africa as a key battleground. In this respect, France had already made significant moves, leaving little room for Italy. Conflicts between the old and new generations of great powers were inevitable. However, during Napoleon III's reign, due to France's strength, the two countries at least maintained superficial peace until the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 shattered Napoleon III's empire. All nations had to adapt to this new European order, led by Germany. When the Franco-Prussian War broke out, Italy's first move was to recapture Rome. To the French, this seemed like a betrayal. Consequently, after the war, Italy sought refuge under Germany's wing. However, another obstacle lay between Rome and Berlin is Vienna. Despite unifying most of its territory with French assistance, Italy still had some land held by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, including Tyrol and Trentino. Joining the German-led alliance required resolving territorial disputes with Austria-Hungary. In Germany's eyes, Italy's importance paled in comparison to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Italy hesitated for a decade until France occupied Tunisia in 1881. Tunisia, home to the ancient city of Carthage, was only 130 miles from Sicily. Naturally, Italy, considering itself Rome's heir, viewed it as within its sphere of influence. Thus, France's actions caused uproar in Italy. The following year, Italy signed the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. By making significant territorial sacrifices, Italy finally secured a powerful safety net. It then determined to use overseas expansion to compensate for its losses. In 1895, Italy launched its first invasion of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian army inflicted a crushing defeat on the Italians in the Battle of Adwa, killing 10,000 and capturing 4,000. It was the most humiliating defeat suffered by Western powers in Africa. Italy instantly became the laughingstock of Europe. Bismarck sarcastically sarcastically remarked, "The Italians have a good stomach, but unfortunately no good teeth." However, the defeat at Adwa did not deter the Italians. In 1908, they encountered a golden opportunity. That year, the Young Turks Revolution erupted in the Ottoman Empire. Seizing this chance, the Giolitti government sent troops to Libya in 1911, igniting the Italo-Turkish War. Despite fielding a force of 100,000, the Italian military faced only about 30,000 Turkish militia, making the disparity in strength apparent. Despite the government's assurance that the war would be resolved within a month, the course of the conflict took an unexpected turn. Enver Pasha, the Turkish commander, rallied Libyans in a jihad, trapping the Italian forces in a guerrilla war. Subsequently, despite further reinforcements, the Italians made no progress and remained confined to a few coastal ports, fearful of venturing further inland. Just when it seemed the Italians were about to suffer another Adwa, the Balkan states intervened. In October 1912, the Quadruple Alliance of Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro officially declared war on the Ottoman Empire. For the Turks, the Italian invasion posed far less of a threat than the rise of the Balkan states. Eventually, the Ottomans agreed to peace with Italy, conceding Libya to avoid the dilemma of fighting on two fronts. The victorious Italians were ecstatic, but before they could savor their triumph, the seeds of trouble they had sown began to sprout. The Italo-Turkish War revealed the Ottoman Empire's weakness, and the Balkan Wars disrupted the balance of power among the great powers. Ultimately, the shot fired in Sarajevo pulled all of Europe into the fray. In a way, the Italians were the first to topple the dominoes, yet now they had the opportunity to stay out of it. Because the Triple Alliance was defensive in nature, neither Germany nor Austria-Hungary harbored any hope of Italian involvement in the war. They recognized that Italy's greatest contribution to the Allies was its ability to remain neutral. This was Italy's advantage. It was the smallest of the great powers and the largest of the small powers. It could adopt a policy of neutrality to garner support from both sides of the conflict. Therefore, Giolitti firmly demanded neutrality in his parliamentary speeches, but his speeches were based on utilitarianism and national interest, and the people simply couldn't understand the government's contradictions on the issue of war. They were more familiar with another discourse, that of nationalist narrative. On August 2nd, 1914, 51-year-old D'Annunzio read in the newspaper about the Italian government's declaration of neutrality. This nationalist poet was furious. He published an article accusing Giolitti and other neutral politicians of being traitors and incited the people to kill them. To understand D'Annunzio's anger, we must still search for answers in Italy's history. In the mid-19th century, Italy's unification was driven by two forces. One was the nationalist faction led by Mazzini and Garibaldi, advocating for Italy for the Italians. This nationalist idea was inherited from the French Revolution. To the nationalists, unity and constitutionalism were two aspects of the same issue. Since the nation-state did not recognize the divine right of kings, its legitimacy came from the authorization of the people, i.e. the constitution. Uniting Italians through a constitution to form a nation was the goal of the nationalists. In the 1848 European revolutions, they raised the banner of Italian independence. With Garibaldi's capture of Rome as a symbol, they pushed the national independence movement to its peak. But soon the revolution was crushed by reactionary forces and Mazzini and Garibaldi went into exile. The task of Italian unification fell into the hands of another faction, led by Cavour. Cavour was the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Sardinia. He himself was not interested in the nationalist independence movement, but was happy to use it to expand the monarchy. In 1859, he secured Napoleon III's support by ceding Savoy and Nice, successfully unifying northern Italy. In 1860, Garibaldi led the Thousand to overthrow the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, achieving the north-south unification of Italy. Garibaldi's historic meeting with King Victor Emmanuel II marked the merger of the nationalist and monarchist factions. Thus, a new form of nationalism, official nationalism, was born. This nationalism, unlike the nationalism of the French era, neither sought the people's identity nor the constitution's authorization. It merely used the new bottle of nationalism to contain the old wine of the monarchical system. However, this form of nationalism had a fatal flaw. Under the old system, it was difficult to foster national identity among citizens. As southern farmers puzzled, Italy is Piedmont and we are Neapolitans. If the French came to rule, it wouldn't make any difference, just change one landlord. The ignorance and lack of patriotism among the lower classes infuriated Italian nationalists. They attributed this to the 1500-year history of foreign enslavement and vowed to recreate the Italian people. They made every possible attempt, including promoting national education, advocating for the Italian language, inventing national myths, and establishing state authority. However, all these efforts invariably ended in failure. As Sonnino said in Parliament, over 90% of the population is completely detached from us in terms of physique. The people find themselves subject to the state, forced to serve the state with their blood and money, without feeling themselves part of the state or interested in its existence or related matters. Just as Italian nationalism was reaching a nadir of despondency, Bismarck provided an answer. The glorious victory in the Franco-Prussian War united the disparate Germanic peoples into a whole. In war, all contradictions, differences, oppression, and estrangements vanish. Only in war can Italy be created. As Italian nationalism shifted towards external expansion, both the government and the populace inevitably got swept up in it. This sentiment reached its peak during Giolitti's administration. The belated Italian victory in Libya gave nationalists hope, but it also stimulated their greater ambitions. D'Annunzio was a devout disciple of this ideology. 2 weeks before the Sarajevo incident, he predicted that war was inevitable. In a letter to the French ambassador in St. Petersburg, he wrote, "We live in a disgusting age, an age devoid of vitality, pride, and virtue. Only war can prevent the people from continuing to degenerate. War presents an unavoidable choice, either glory or death. Therefore, perhaps you fear the impending war, while I eagerly await its arrival with all my heart and soul." So, when D'Annunzio learned that the Italian government intended to stay out of this decisive war for Europe's destiny, he penned a manifesto. "The parliament is Giolitti, and Giolitti is the parliament. Truly, a shameful combination. This is the old Italy, which fails to realize that a new Italy is rising from history and the future. The struggle will continue until death. Either the parliament destroys the nation, selling the sacred homeland to foreigners once again, or the nation overthrows the parliament, evolving into the headquarters of steel and fire." This inflammatory speech received widespread acclaim domestically, even from many of his erstwhile enemies, including Mussolini. On October 18, 1914, the 31-year-old Mussolini published an editorial in his newspaper calling on the Italian government to heed the people's call and join the war immediately. Yet just 2 years earlier, he had been a staunch anti-war advocate, bitterly denouncing Giolitti for leading the people to the executioner's block. So why such a dramatic shift in thought in just 2 years? It starts with Mussolini's political background. Avanti was affiliated with the Italian Socialist Party, the oldest leftist party in Italian history. As early as the 19th century, the anarchist Bakunin saw the potential in Italy. He asserted that Italy and Russia were the most likely European countries to erupt in revolution because both countries' industrialization was highly abnormal. Italy, located on the Apennine Peninsula, was mostly mountainous. Mountains meant transportation difficulties, and transportation was a crucial aspect of industrialization. The same problem also plagued the Iberian Peninsula and the Balkans. Fortunately, the Apennine Peninsula had sea routes connecting it. However, this made Italy's industrialization heavily dependent on transit trade, unable to connect its domestic market. If transportation issues could be overcome, the next problem was even more fatal. Italy lacked coal, with over 80% of coal needing to be imported. In the early stages of industrialization, you could lack raw materials or labor, but you couldn't lack energy, because then your production costs would skyrocket, making domestic production less cost-effective than imports. Italy's industrialization struggled under such conditions. By 1913, Italy's steel production was only 1/8 of Britain's, 1/7 of Germany's, and even only 2/5 of Belgium's. The only thing Italy could compete with other countries on was manpower. Unified Italy had an abundance of rural population and could always keep labor costs at a bare minimum, but the consequence of doing so was the flourishing of various leftist ideologies and labor movements. Taking the Italian Socialist Party as an example, it was formally established in 1892, and by 1902, 250,000 workers had joined the Italian General Confederation of Labor it had created. With this solid base of supporters, the Socialist Party won 210,000 votes and 32 seats in the 1900 general elections. By 1913, its seats had increased to 79, and it had won half of all votes. At this rate, it was only a matter of time before the Socialist Party took power, and the only thing that could stop them was war. Unlike nationalism, leftist ideology saw all foreign wars as a ploy to bleed the proletariat's last drop of blood. However, such anti-war sentiment was effective only against small-scale wars like the Italo-Turkish War. When a large-scale war like World War I erupted, the existential crisis overwhelmed all social contradictions, and leftist narratives gave way to nationalist narratives. Mussolini was the intelligent man who saw the situation clearly. After the Forward published that pro-war article, he quickly distanced himself from the Socialist Party. Subsequently, he founded the Italian People's Tribune, criticizing socialists for only seeing domestic contradictions and ignoring international injustices. If they claimed everything belonged to the proletariat, then why couldn't Italy, as a nation of proletarians, fight for its inherent rights? In reality, what happened to Mussolini was not isolated. When World War I broke out, almost all left-wing parties in Europe experienced divisions, leading to the dissolution of the Second International due to disagreements over the war. Germany's Social Democratic Party also immediately declared that there would be no strikes during the war. From this perspective, World War I significantly delayed the imminent revolution in Europe. But for the Italian government, the situation was quite the opposite. Their neutral policy became the target of nationalists and some leftists. Now they only had two options: join the war or fall. By 1915, the Italian government began actively considering offers from both sides. In this regard, the Allies were always at a disadvantage because Italy coveted territories mostly held by Austria-Hungary. However, Austria's attitude, as expressed by Chief of the General Staff Conrad, was clear. Rather than compromising with Italians, I'd prefer to make peace with the Russians by ceding territories. Yet, due to Conrad's own genius command, the Austrian army suffered losses of millions of troops in 1914 and was on the verge of collapse. Under pressure from Berlin, Vienna had to negotiate with Rome. Austria's initial offer was to immediately cede Trentino and allow a plebiscite in Trieste. After the war, they didn't require Italy to join the war, just to remain neutral. Although this offer could regain territories without a single soldier's sacrifice, it lacked appeal to Italy because the Allies promised even more. On April 26th, the Italian government signed the Treaty of London with England and France, preliminarily accepting the terms offered by the Allies. A few days later, Italy officially withdrew from the Triple Alliance, signaling its imminent entry into the war. Meanwhile, Germany and Austria were preparing for the Gorlice-Tarnow offensive and had no time to spare. On May 9th, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador to Rome presented the most generous offer yet: immediate cession of Trentino and Trieste to Italy and the establishment of a free city of Rijeka under Italian guardianship. This offer completely swayed Mussolini, who first secured the support of the majority of parliamentarians and then forced Prime Minister Salandra to resign. At this moment, a nationwide pro-war demonstration erupted. D'Annunzio called for beheading Giolitti, while Mussolini proclaimed it was time for a new government. Seeing the tide turning against him, Giolitti fled Rome on May 18th. 2 days later, the Chamber of Deputies passed the war proposal with a vote of 407 to 74. The Socialist Party voted against it, being the only left-wing party in Europe, apart from the Bolsheviks, to clearly oppose the war. On May 23rd, Italy officially declared war on Austria-Hungary, heralding the long-awaited war. On May 23, 1915, Marshal Luigi Cadorna, 65, was ordered to launch an offensive against the Austro-Hungarian forces. At that time, Cadorna commanded nearly 1 million troops, most of them hastily recruited. Many new recruits hadn't even received basic military training. Moreover, due to Italy's natural disadvantage in heavy industry, many weapons had to be imported. Additionally, most of Italy's military budget was allocated to the navy, leaving the army under-equipped for years. The entire nation could only muster 1,000 cannons and a mere 618 machine guns. However, the key to the war was morale. If the Italian soldiers could unite and overcome their equipment shortages, victory might be possible. But the soldiers' morale was severely tested. Italy's conscription system, modelled after Prussia's, shortened the service from 5 to 3 years. Despite the government's efforts to romanticize military service, it held little appeal for rural farmers, who saw it as a forced blood tax. Many resorted to self-mutilation to avoid conscription. The harsh military life further fueled their fears. Italian nationalists viewed the military as a school to forge national spirit, but it often led to abuse and bullying by officers. Military officers could arbitrarily punish subordinates, and accidents often went unpunished. In such a country with weak national consciousness and sharp class contradictions, soldiers didn't know what they were fighting for. Command obedience relied heavily on the officer's authority. When this army entered the battlefield, disaster was almost inevitable. In early June, Cadorna launched an offensive with 18 divisions, totaling 220,000 troops, attacking the Isonzo River positions from 3 directions. The Isonzo was the only passage from the Adriatic Peninsula to Austrian territory. On the eastern bank of the Isonzo lay the formidable Alps, where the Austrians had built an impassable line of defense. Cadorna's plan was to break through the Isonzo before the Austrians could react, march straight to Vienna, but due to the slow movement of the Italian troops, it took them a whole month to complete the assembly. Meanwhile, the Austrians reinforced their lines from 20,000 to 200,000 men. On June 23rd, the first battle of the Isonzo began. The battle was bloody. Italian soldiers soldiers had to cross a dense network of firepower and then climb miles of barbed wire to attack the cement fortress on the mountaintop. In just one day, the Italians lost 15,000 soldiers and ran out of ammunition, forcing them to wait 11 days for supplies. During this time, the Austrian army reinforced its defences. On July 18th, the fighting resumed. The Italian army initially broke through and engaged in close combat with the Austrians on the Kars Plateau, but just when they seemed to gain the upper hand, logistical issues hampered their progress again. Running out of ammunition, the Italians had to halt their advance, relinquishing the gains they had made. After the battle, they counted 40,000 casualties, more than half of the frontline troops. By October, as winter approached, supplying the troops became even more difficult. Daily rations fell below 1,000 calories, and soldiers' pay was meager. In such harsh conditions, desertion became rampant. To deter deserters, the Italian army revived the ancient Roman tradition of decimation. Soon, this punishment extended beyond deserters. On October 9th, due to bad weather, the Italian army postponed an attack. Someone in the army shouted, "Hail to the fog," prompting the commander to order the execution of 90 soldiers, who were then tied up and shot in front of everyone. Later, they were granted a reprieve due to the intervention of the army chaplain, but almost the entire unit was wiped out on a suicide mission, with only 4 survivors. On October 18th, with no breakthrough in sight, Cadorna decided to boost morale with a large-scale attack. By then, the Italians had received supplies from Britain and France, with frontline artillery numbers reaching 1,200 and every soldier equipped with French steel helmets. However, the attack turned into a disaster as the Austrians were also reinforced, thanks to Bulgaria joining the war. By October, the Austrians had nearly 400,000 troops on the Alpine front. The Italians had lost their numerical advantage they had at the beginning of the war. The result was that they lost another 110,000 men in the next 2 offensives. When the campaign ended, Austrian Chief of Staff Borowicz mocked, "Apart from a few stones, they got nothing." Thus ended the War of 1915, with Cadorna's hoped-for lightning strike halted at the Isonzo, lasting 2 years. During these 2 years, the Italian army suffered 600,000 killed, 950,000 wounded, and 250,000 permanently disabled, advancing only 10 miles on the front line. In the Caporetto battle 2 years later, the Italian army lost all its gains in just one day, with 260,000 soldiers surrendering without a fight. Cadorna called this the most severe treason Italy had ever suffered since its founding. But for those soldiers who had experienced 2 years of desperate fighting and countless sacrifices, they gained only a few stones in return. At that time, talking to them about the homeland was like a joke. War writer Mariani once interviewed a veteran, asking him about fighting for the homeland. The veteran, pounding the table in anger, replied, "My homeland is home on leave. My homeland is my family and my house." This is war given high hopes by D'Annunzio and Mussolini to reshape Italy's sacred war. Reviewing Italy's history of participation in wars, we find that a nation's decision-making is quite complex, driven more by emotion than reason, more influenced by public opinion than self-interest. So why is this? Why is D'Annunzio's agitation more powerful than Giolitti's analysis? This is because a nation's power comes from authority. Before the Great Revolution, this authority was divinely bestowed. After the Great Revolution, this authority became granted by the people. Therefore, national consciousness was abstracted, replacing the position of God. Giolitti talked about conflicts of interest, while D'Annunzio appealed to moral judgment. The two forces were unequal because no interest could be higher than the Italian nation, not even national interest. But the problem is that Italian nationalism itself is a compromise. As Marx said, it always carries on its rear the feudal heraldry of the past. Such nationalism naturally cannot gain true acceptance. D'Annunzio's proposal was to emulate Bismarck's war, but this observation completely reverses causality. The greatest motivation for the formation of the German nation was not the Franco-Prussian War, but industrial development. Even unification itself was for the sake of the customs union. After all, only when the people fully feel the progress of the country and share in its fruits can genuine national identity be generated. Italy lacks these conditions, therefore Italy's expansion abroad was doomed to be a tragedy. When nationalism fails to fulfill the promises of the Great Revolution, people will turn to another force, which is the left. Left-wing forces in Germany, Russia and Italy have all experienced rapid development. These 3 countries share a common feature. They all failed in the 1848 revolution, or were the headquarters of reactionary forces. The failure of one revolution inevitably leads to a second revolution. The victory of conservatism will inevitably give birth to more radical changes. At this time, World War I happened to come at the right time. In order to stifle the impending revolution, the ruling groups in Europe were willing to start a mutually destructive war. But the price paid for this was the lives of ordinary people who had no say in their own destiny. destinies. Italy's story is not unique to Italy. The same thing happened in every country in Europe. It constantly reminds people that if they don't care about social contradictions, if they don't care about social change, then all the prosperity they see is just a mirage. After all, in a world without a government, every country is just one step away from war.